Hey everybody, it's 3 o'clock, it's Tuesday, that means it's Tech Tuesday. Today I'm going to be talking about the Biden administration's executive order that just came out a few days ago that will have some impact for broadband operators. I'll be right back. Hey, thanks for joining me again. I'm Rick Uzzi, Z-Quorum. I am here every Tuesday at 3 o'clock for Tech Tuesday when I cover topics that would be of interest to telecommunications provider companies, cable companies, telephone companies, anybody providing broadband really. And again, what I'm going to talk about today is this executive order that came out a few days ago from the Biden administration. And this was July 9th. And there are some things in here that broadband operators need to be thinking about, just need to be aware of, that are coming out. So you'll be seeing, I'm sure, some more details on this as maybe some of these things start to take shape. So I'm just going to go through some of the more salient points, specifically some of those things that affect broadband operators. There are a few things that could affect all kinds of companies, including broadband operators. And I may touch on a few of those as well. So, Section 1 policy. I'm going to scroll through most of this. It talks about agriculture, industry, and things that are not really relevant. But one of the things that they're trying to promote is competition, which is good for consumers, right? So that's going to drive down prices. So that's good for Americans. And it says here today, a small number of dominant internet platforms use their power to exclude market entrants to extract monopoly profits and to gather intimate personal information that they can exploit for their own advantage. Now, I think what they're talking about here, which is interesting because not much of this has been talked about from the Democrats, is the big tech companies that are doing, like Google, YouTube, Twitter, some of those companies that are really are kind of monopolies, especially as they handle information. So, they are basically the arbiters of what you see because they are the content providers. So whether it's whether you search for something on Google and whatever that content comes up, they control, or posts that are showing up in your Facebook feed. And again, there's only so many competitors there. There's different kinds of social platforms, but there's really only one dominant Facebook. There's Twitter that's dominant in that space, kind of the micro blog, if you would. There's Google, a dominant search engine. Bing's out there, but so they definitely dominate. So this is interesting in that they are, they mentioned the personal information there that they could exploit to their own advantage. So I think they're probably talking about them in that particular case. In the telecommunications sector, Americans likewise pay too much for broadband, cable television, and other communication services, in part because of a lack of adequate competition. So they're saying there that in certain areas, of the country, in some areas of the country, there's lots of competition. You could have a cable operator, you could have a fiber operator, you could have a wireless, you got your wireless internet, maybe a fixed wireless provider, satellites coming out, although that's probably not going to be much of a competitor in urban areas. But in rural areas, there's not that much competition a lot of times. It might be one incumbent. It could be the local telephone company, the local cable company. Sometimes the two are competing with each other. It could be that maybe that there's just good DSL service in an area, so there's not good broadband. Maybe it's high priced. Again, there's satellite that's coming out that's going to be more appropriate for rural broadband areas, but that's going to be kind of priced high. But that is a competitor that's coming out that is going to make some of these rural providers that are not providing good service. I think that's going to make them have to really step up the game. Now, if you're in a rural area and you've got a cable operator or a phone company that's providing good high-speed internet through DOCSIS 3.0, 3.1, or fiber, then satellite's still going to have a hard time getting in there, because a good wired connection, if it's reasonably priced, is going to be a lot of times what people are going to choose. But in areas where there's not good service, satellite will make an impact. Meanwhile, the United States faces new challenges to its economic standing in the world, including unfair competitive pressures from foreign monopolies and firms that are state-owned or state-sponsored, or whose market power is directly supported by foreign governments. So that's interesting and ironic for a couple of reasons. One, it was just talking about, prices are high in the United States. Well, we do have a free market here, so that does tend to drive down prices when you have competition, and if you don't, you have that monopoly kind of situation, and it's talking about that in certain areas. But here, they're saying that in some foreign companies that the internet is either owned by the state or maybe it's subsidized by the state, so that's going to drive prices down. So it's kind of ironic because the Biden administration is pushing for state monopolies in a sense for cities, I should say city monopolies, because they really want to get municipalities into the broadband business, and that makes it difficult for private operators. So if a municipality gets in the broadband business and maybe they're subsidized by taxpayer dollars, they can keep the prices low, they're not really there to make a profit, they're there just to provide good service. Well, that makes it difficult for the companies that are there trying to make a profit, right? Because that's why they stay in business. So it's kind of an ironic statement there. This order affirms that it is the policy of my administration to enforce the antitrust laws to combat the excessive concentration of industry, the abuses of market power, and the harmful effects of monopoly and monopsony. And that was a new word for me. I've not heard of that. So monopoly is kind of the opposite of monopoly. A monopoly is where you've got one provider and multiple customers, one provider, and that provider controls the market so they can keep the prices high. Monopsony is when you've got one customer, right? Yeah, you've got one customer in a sense, and companies that are trying to sell to that one customer, and that one customer then holds a lot of power and can dictate things. And what's kind of ironic about that is exactly what a one-payer system in healthcare would be. So if Biden wants to put a one-payer public healthcare system in play, then that would be a monopsony, where that would be one customer buying healthcare services, and it would be difficult then for all the doctors and others to operate in that system. So I thought that was ironic as well. In labor markets, agricultural markets, internet platform industries, healthcare markets, including insurance, hospital, and prescription drug markets, repair markets. So they're talking about these monopolies, monopsonies. Now, of course, again, a monopsony in the healthcare market would be what they were talking about as far as nationalized healthcare. It is also the policy of my administration to enforce the antitrust laws to meet the challenges posed by new industries and technologies, including the rise of the dominant internet platforms, especially as they stem from serial mergers, the acquisition of nascent competitors, and the aggregation of data, unfair competition in attention markets, the surveillance of users, and the presence of network effects. So, this is kind of broad, but I think what you're going to see here as we read through this is that, some of the mergers and acquisitions that have taken place in the past or that are going to be taking place in the future, maybe the ones that have taken place in the past might not have been approved, who knows, but some of these ones that are looked at, if one broadband operator is looking at acquiring another and that they feel like that's going to reduce competition, then that may be harder to get through these days. This order reaffirms that the United States retains the authority to challenge transactions whose previous consummation was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, other laws. And it also talks about the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So this was the whole net neutrality thing, which was first instituted by the Obama administration by taking portions or selectively applying portions of the Telecom Act of 1996 to internet providers. So it was really an act that was meant for telephone companies. 1996 was just at the very beginning of the internet. So the original law, I think, was 1934, I believe, was updated in 1996. And again, it was really specifically for telephone companies. They tried to kind of shoehorn that in the Obama administration for broadband operators, and they picked specific things out of that and made that apply to broadband operators. Left it kind of wide open where, other parts, maybe there could be creep and other things could have gotten in there as well. But that was all taken out from by the Trump administration. So, and nothing really happened, right? So it's always been net neutral, the internet. There have been a few things that have happened here and there. Those have been addressed without net neutrality regulations or laws. But the internet, as we know, it works fine. I mean, even with the pandemic, companies have been stepping up. People can get anywhere they want on the internet. There's no issues like that. Competition is keeping prices down, and the amount of broadband access has been growing, especially throughout this last year or two during the pandemic. So it's not really a need for it, but they are wanting to implement that again. In order to do that, right now the FCC is a tie. I think it's 3-3, and they need to put another Democrat on that in order to be able to even have a shot at getting this through the FCC. But the last time this was looked at, they really felt like this should be handled in the legislative branch, so that the legislative branch should go ahead and create something new specifically for broadband rather than trying to use really old legislation that wasn't necessarily or really specifically aimed at broadband. So we'll have to see where that goes. But there's going to be this focus on net neutrality and maybe doing something with the Telecom Act of 1996. They talk about the statutory basis of all of this, which does talk about all of these antitrust laws, different kinds of things here. It says these statutes independently charge a number of executive departments and agencies to protect conditions of fair competition in one or more ways, including policing unfair, deceptive, and abusive business practices, resisting consolidation and promoting competition within industries through the independent oversight of mergers, acquisitions, and joint ventures. So again, they're going to be looking very carefully at any of those kinds of business activities that could possibly reduce competition, maybe raise prices or make it more difficult for consumers. Promulgating rules that promote competition, including market entry of new competitors. That's kind of, I believe, alluding to what I was talking about with really promoting municipalities and maybe electric utilities getting in the broadband business. And again, this can be difficult for private operators if there's subsidies or tax dollars that are supporting those efforts. Promoting market transparency through compelled disclosure of information. We'll see some of that here in a minute. I'll show you, I think, what they're talking about there. Such an approach is supported by existing statutory mandates. Agencies can and should further the policies set forth in Section 1 of this order by, among other things, adopting pro-competitive regulations and approaches to procurement and spending, and by rescinding regulations that create unnecessary barriers to entry that stifle competition. Now, that is one of the things, in addition to, I was talking about them promoting municipal broadband. Well, one of the things that's happening on the other side is there are laws in several states that restrict municipal broadband, that say you can't do that. In fact, in Ohio, just a few weeks ago, the budget came out with something that said you cannot provide broadband internet if there's somebody already in the business, and the bar for that was really low. It's like if they were providing 10 megabits per second down, then they were considered served, and a municipality could not offer broadband, and if the municipality was offering broadband, they had to get out of the business. Well, that did not make it into the final budget, but there are laws like that, not maybe quite as onerous, but there are laws like that in various states that do restrict munis from getting into the internet business, and I believe there are some that restrict EMCs or electric co-ops from getting in the business. So this is saying that that will not be tolerated. Agency cooperation and oversight, investigation, and remedies. So when agencies have overlapping jurisdiction, they should endeavor to cooperate fully in the exercise of their oversight authority to benefit from the respective expertise of the agencies and to improve government efficiency. So they're basically saying two agencies can work together, and that's actually what's being done and what the Trump administration was putting in place or promoting when they took out the net neutrality regulations. They said, we've got this all covered with the FCC and the FTC. So the FCC is the organization that's keeping on top of these things. If there's any complaints that come in, it could go to the FCC, or the FCC is looking at this from their perspective. And then the FTC is the enforcement arm if that needs to take place. So that would be an example of two agencies working together in a situation like that. Then they are going to be creating this White House Competition Council. So this is a group of folks that are going to be meeting together. Council shall coordinate, promote, and advance federal government efforts to address overconcentration, monopolization, and unfair competition. Implement the administrative actions identified in this order. So this is the council that's going to be looking at all this stuff and then trying to implement everything. Develop procedures and best practices for agency cooperation, like I just talked about. Identify and advance any additional administrative actions, maybe the stuff that's not covered in this executive order, they can put that forward. Identify any potential legislative changes necessary. So they may, for example, look at the Telecom Act of '96 and net neutrality and what they want to do, and maybe they say, you know what, why don't we just make a push for some new legislation that better fits broadband technology. Work across agencies to provide a coordinated response to overconcentration, monopolization, and unfair competition. So here's the people that consist of. So that'll consist of basically secretaries of several different agencies, Department of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Transportation, the Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and heads of other agencies and offices may participate from time to time. So the chair of the FTC and the chair of the FCC would participate in this as well. And they're going to meet on a semi-annual basis. So this is not going to be their full-time job, but twice a year, if necessary. It says they may determine that a meeting is not necessary. But certainly I would think in the beginning they'll be meeting twice a year to get these things done. So it says to address the consolidation of industry in many markets across the economy, as described in Section 1 of this order, the Attorney General and the Chair of the FTC are encouraged to review the horizontal and vertical merger guidelines and consider whether to revise those guidelines. They'll be looking again at mergers and what they need to change, if anything. To address agreements that may unduly limit workers' ability to change jobs. The chair of the FTC is encouraged to consider working with the rest of the Commission to exercise the FTC's statutory rulemaking authority under the Federal Trade Commission Act to curtail the unfair use of non-compete clauses and other clauses or agreements that may unfairly limit worker mobility. So there might be, this is common a lot of times in the tech industry when you've got a good amount of intellectual property and sometimes a lot of information in people's brains, where they'll put a non-compete clause in so that somebody can't go from their company to a competitor right away, because they could take a lot of that intellectual knowledge, whatever it might be, with them. So this is saying that that's going to probably be harder. They're already hard to enforce, but it's probably going to make it a little harder to enforce. I don't know how much of that is in the broadband industry, but if you've got an employee working at a local cable company, maybe today they can't go work for the local phone company because they might have too much knowledge in their head about the competitor and technology and those kinds of things. To address persistent and recurrent practices that inhibit competition, the chair of the FTC, in the chair's discretion, is also encouraged to consider working with the rest of the Commission to exercise the FTC's statutory rulemaking authority as appropriate and consistent with applicable law in areas such as unfair data collection and surveillance practices that may damage competition, consumer autonomy, and consumer privacy. So, we've got some privacy laws here in the United States. In Europe, they've got stricter laws that were passed several years ago. I believe they passed some stricter laws in California, but we may see that in the United States they pass laws that are similar to what they have in Europe. So we'll have to see where this takes place. But this would impact anybody who is collecting information via your website, those kinds of things. A lot of companies have already taken steps because of the laws in the EU. A lot of companies have already taken steps to try to make their websites and their data collection in compliance with those things, so there may not be that big of a change here. A lot of times, now when you go to a website, you'll see a lot of times there'll be a pop-up at the bottom of the site or the top of the site that says, hey, we are collecting cookies in order to provide a better experience. If you agree, click here, that kind of thing. That was all really as a result of the European or EU changes in privacy. Unfair competition in major internet marketplaces. So again, that's going to be a high priority, would be trying to get more competitors and make sure that there's not unfair competition. Any other unfair industry-specific practices that substantially inhibit competition. So pretty wide open there as to what they're talking about doing. Let's see, I think there's a few other things down here. I think we're talking about specifically, we're talking about telecom specifically here. So to promote competition, lower prices, and a vibrant and innovative telecommunications ecosystem, the chair of the Federal Communications Commission is encouraged to work with the rest of the Commission as appropriate and consistent with applicable law to consider adopting through appropriate rulemaking net neutrality rules similar to those previously adopted under Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. And again, that was the original act. So 1934 is the original rules. A lot of the original rules were from that, not just the 1996 act. So again, whether they do that or whether they seek other legislation, we'll have to see. Conducting future spectrum auctions under rules that are designed to help avoid excessive concentration of spectrum license holdings in the United States, so as to prevent spectrum stockpiling, warehousing of spectrum licenses, or the creation of barriers to entry. and to improve the conditions of competition in industries that depend upon radio spectrum, including mobile communications and radio-based broadband services. So, spectrum auctions have been done in the past, and they've tried to keep them fair and to prevent people from hoarding spectrum. So I'm not sure what additional they'll do here, but the whole point here is to try to make sure that we have enough spectrum to be able to do things like 5G. You see right here, providing support for the continued development and adoption of 5G, O-RAN protocols and software, undertaking any other measures that might promote increased openness, innovation, and competition in the markets for 5G equipment, prohibiting unjust or unreasonably early termination fees for end-user communications contracts, enabling consumers to more easily switch providers. So that could definitely be an impact for some providers that you sign up for them and you're in a 2-year agreement. I understand why some of that is there, because if you're going to bring a customer on, you could charge a higher setup fee to make sure that you're going to recover your costs, because it does take a while sometimes for operators. By the time they get the customer set up, even though they send out the equipment, you might be paying $10 a month for that equipment or whatever. It takes a while for that customer to become profitable. It might take 6 months, even a year, maybe, for that customer where you're getting profit. And then from there, you hope to keep that customer for a long time. So the point here is that they're going to be looking at these contracts that, if you exit it, then you wind up probably having to pay X number of months. So they're going to be looking at that. This is something that might impact certain providers if you have long-term commitments that people sign up for. Initiating a rulemaking that requires broadband service providers to display a broadband consumer label. So what they're talking about here is, again, this is kind of that open information that I mentioned earlier. So this was proposed in 2016 and was being looked at. They were calling it actually a broadband nutrition label, because you look at it, it looks like the kind of label that you'd see from on your food. So if you look at it, you've got, and the point here is to try, just like for a food label, when you go to the grocery store and you look at 2 food labels, it's easy to compare them because everything is, all the same information is on each label and it's in the same spot. So if you want to know how much sugar does this have, how much sugar does this have, you don't have to look in different places, and maybe it's not there on one and it's not on the other, and you can't find it on one because it's somewhere down at the bottom and the other one it's at the top. So I think this is a great idea. And this was not real onerous, so I think it's fine that they're bringing this back. So you can see here you've got the kind of information that somebody might want to know if they're comparing internet providers. So you've got your monthly charge, month-to-month plan, or if you do a 2-year contract plan, you can save $5. Hey, there might be links to some other things on the website there. How much data is included, charges for additional usage. You've got, if you're going to rent the modem, it gives you that information. If there's any other monthly fees, that would be listed. Activation fees or one-time fees, activation, deposit, installation, early termination fee. So these, if they do allow that, in this case, again, this was from 2016, but if they allow early termination fees, you'd have that listed here so that it would be, when you're looking at this provider, you'd go, okay, well, that's something to take into consideration. Typical speed downstream, upstream, typical latency. This will probably, there may be something in any new rules that are proposed that would require companies to do some kinds of performance monitoring on a regular basis. That is required if companies are taking RDOF money, for example, or CAF2 money. That would be Rural Development Opportunity Fund or the Connect America Fund prior to that. You have to do this performance testing just to prove that you're providing the service that you said you were going to provide, because you're taking money from the government. Well, it could be that they would make that mandatory for everybody. I don't know that that's the case, but you see that they would have it here on the label. This was, again, a label back from 2016, so they may resurrect this. We'll have to see. Application-specific network management practices. That was part of these 2 things here in subscriber-triggered network management practices. This was part of the net neutrality rules that were in place back then, is that as an ISP, you had to report whether you were doing any kind of network management or any kind of throttling, for example, so that if an individual subscriber reaches a certain threshold, maybe it's a certain amount that they have transferred per month, then you would start to throttle their connection. So that would need to be noted on here as well. And then, again, some links to some other things. So that would be the broadband nutrition label. I think it's kind of a funny way to put it, but that is exactly what it looks like. Also here, so as to give consumers, well, this is why they're doing it, so as to give consumers clear, concise, and accurate information regarding provider fees, prices and fees, performance, and network practices. Initiating a rulemaking to require broadband service providers to regularly report broadband price and subscription rates to the FCC for the purpose of disseminating that information to the public in a useful manner to improve price transparency and market functioning. Well, that's interesting. So that might mean that you, in addition to having this broadband label maybe on your website, that you would have to provide similar kinds of information to the FCC, where maybe consumers could go to that FCC database and pull information about that. Might be part of the broadband map, the new map that they're working on, where I wouldn't be surprised, so that you would go to a particular area and you'd see who all of the operators were in your area. Then you can click on that and you would get specific information about these kinds of things also from that map. Initiating a rulemaking to prevent landlords and cable internet service providers from inhibiting tenants' choices among providers. So that's interesting as well for those of you that might be providing service to MDUs or apartment buildings obviously, but other kinds of multi-tenant kinds of, or multi-residential kinds of units, where they will be frowning upon you limiting other competitors from coming into there. So we'll have to see what comes about from that. So I believe that was it. So yeah, as you can see, it's a very long document. So there's a lot in here about drug prices and farmers and other kinds of things, but a lot of it is focused on telecom providers. So that's kind of the highlights of it, and it remains to be seen how this will all play out over time. I'm sure we'll see some additional kinds of or maybe executive orders that follow onto this, or legislation that follows onto this, or just the agencies themselves implementing some of these things. So we'll see that coming out as they are tasked to make all this happen, the different agencies to implement this executive order. So thanks for joining me. I hope this was helpful. If so, please give me a thumbs up on YouTube, if you would, on the video. If you've got any comments, feel free to type those in, and we'll get back to you later. And if you do like this, subscribe to our channel. Just click the subscribe button. Ring the little bell, and when you ring the bell, you'll be notified whenever I'm live. And that's once a week, every Tuesday for Tech Tuesday. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.